When we were talking about launching this podcast, especially in the midst of our 50th anniversary year as a trade association, it was a no-brainer to try and sort of call back on the history of where SEIA has been. So we were really excited to invite Sam Taylor, who's one of the co-founders of SEIA, 50 years ago, into the podcast studio to chat a little bit about what his experience was like and sort of how he's seen both SEIA and the industry at large evolve and grow over the last 50 years.
Right. And this is a cool episode because Washington 50 years later is not all that different than it was in 1974. So you can really see the interplay between what the White House looks like now versus what the White House looked like then. And, the country was at war. We were fighting over appropriations, same as today. So he's able to play out what it took to get a trade association like this off the ground so long ago and the kind of partnerships it required to get people in Washington to take him seriously.
Yeah. Yeah. And, his story is an exciting and interesting one, but it's certainly one of many. So I, would encourage our listeners to share your own stories about maybe where you've seen the industry grow over the last couple of decades or even 50 years if you've been around that long. But stay active with us on social media and share your perspective on the solar century, as we're calling it. But this is a fun glimpse into that past.
I just wanted to say thank you for being here. We're so happy with the 50th anniversary of SEIA coming up to have a founder of SEIA here with us.
Co-founder.
Co-founder.
Yeah.
That's right. Who did you found SEIA with?
Jim Ince. This was late summer or early fall of 1973. At the time, I was a science policy consultant and an energy advisor to Hubert Humphrey, as well as I had different other clients. In fact, with Arthur D. Little, I was on a contract for tech assessment, and this grew out of my work the previous year, which was in the transfer of technologies to the state and local governments, and sort of related to the research applied to national needs. And this was a contract with NASA. Okay, that ended at the end of the fiscal year, which was June 30th of 74. But that was quite an experience. And Jim Ince, I met with him. It was an I had been representing another association of about 3,000 scientists and engineers trying to save the space program.
And this is 1974?
73.
73.
72, 73.
Got it.
Okay. And I had testified before a number of committees, and that year, in April of 73, I testified before the House Appropriations Committee. And that testimony was prepared in cooperation with the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, as well as Rockwell International and others, and some of the pioneers like Kraft Ericke, who were from Peenemünde. And so that 72, 73, I met with people like Werner von Braun and others, okay. So, and Peter Glaser, and you name it. But it was an interesting time. Let me give you a little background on that time, okay? The NASA budget, in order to be first on the moon, risen to 2 to 3% of our GDP, comparable to our defense budget. We were in the middle of a war. We were increasingly vulnerable in terms of our energy supplies, particularly since the 67 Israeli war, the Six-Day War, where they effectively closed off the Suez Canal, which didn't get opened again until about 75. And there were a lot of tensions that were growing at the time, between Israel and Egypt and other countries. And so, at any rate, we were going from a country that had a surplus of oil to one that reserves were declining, and our appetite for oil was increasing to the point, I think, around 69, 70, we would almost reach 6 million barrels a day in imported oil. Okay. We didn't have very efficient cars. After the testimony, or during the time of the testimony, I gave a copy of my testimony to a guy named Tim Barnacle, who was legislative assistant to Humphrey. At the time, I was dealing with his office on some science policy legislation. And Tim came in one day and said, "Hey, I noticed there was something that you said on solar energy, because we addressed the potential of manufacturing in space with solar, And I said, yeah. And he said, well, could you do me a favor? Could you draft a letter to the editor from the senator to a particular newspaper? I think it was a Christian Science Monitor, I'm not sure. And I said, okay. So I did. And then shortly after that, he comes running back and says, wow, we got a great response. Could you do something more? And I said, yes. How about creating the National Solar Energy Program?
What was the tone of the letter to the editor? What was the sort of scope of that? Just
I don't remember. I've been looking for that
Yeah.
letter. I have a bunch of files, historic files in the attic.
Yeah.
And I think this is not as accessible as I would like. I was looking for a particular file which had my early White House history and so forth. Okay. So we agreed. I started drafting the Solar Research, Development, and Demonstration Act, which was introduced in 1973. And then, of course, because of the change to the Congress, it had to be reintroduced in 1974, and that was done in March of 1974. And it became law and signed into law in around October, November of 1974 by President Ford. Okay.
Can I ask you a foundational question?
Yes.
So this is an amazing sort of description of how things got started, and I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about how you were thinking about standing up SEIA so long ago. So picturing Washington in 1974, right? Like you said, there's a war going on. It's kind of a wild place. Watergate's happening. I sort of envision you sitting around a table that looks a little something like this in the basement of the Washington Hilton. Maybe you guys are smoking. I don't know. You've got
Not quite. Okay.
What does it look like?
Put us in the room.
Put us there.
SEIA started much earlier.
Okay.
Let's talk about the late summer, early fall of 1973. I met with Jim Ince at his office on Farragut Square North, okay? And we started talking, and I said, what are you doing? And I explained what I was doing with Senator Humphrey and others in my consulting work also. And he said, solar energy, is there a trade association, an industry trade association for solar? And I said, I don't think so. So he said, well, do you think there's interest in it? And so we agreed to explore whether there was interest in an industry trade association. And he said, what do you think we should call it? And I said, how about Solar Energy Industries Association? He said, fine. So
Easy enough.
That's exactly how your name got started.
That's great. That's great.
And so I called Peter Glazer in trying to put this together and sort out the industry interest. I called Peter Glazer and I asked him, because I knew he had a multi-client study on solar heating, or as they called it, the solar climate control multi-client study. And that was kind of critical because it was assessing the business prospects for solar water heating and solar heating. And it had about 90 clients. It was a multi-client study. So he said, why don't you call the government, Sheldon Butt, who is chair of the Government Affairs Committee, and these are the people that are looking in this area of, a government role as well as, the future of the industry association, of the industry organizations. So I called Sheldon, and he may have thought it was a little early, but he said, sure, let's continue this, because at that time he was, based on the early work, that they found that definitely solar heating, and particularly water heating, was technically feasible. That in some areas of the world, Australia, Israel, formerly South Florida, it was cost effective. And so so we started working together, and around it was actually Thanksgiving week of 1973, we pulled the first meeting together of what became your board of directors. It was earlier, and so these were the folks from the Sheldon Butts committee. It was either Monday or Tuesday, before on Thanksgiving week. So it's and so we got together and discussed the interest and whether it was too early or not too early or whatever. But we agreed to continue to put this together.
Did you get any pushback? Right. Yeah. So was there wind of this happening in Washington? Washington's not all that different of a place 50 years later. So were there any conversations when people started finding out what you were thinking about doing from maybe some detractors in
skeptics?
Right.
Oh yeah. I mean, there was some a little, Sheldon or others, were saying, is it too early, because we don't, but they all agreed that we should continue the process in order to generate interest in this. Jim and I decided to create 2 newsletters, one general purpose and one focused on the industry, a solar industry newsletter. And when I was putting together the charter, because of my interest, and actually the senator was passionate about photovoltaics, I put in photovoltaics, and what have you as one of the thrusts. And I said, well, wait a minute. We're solar heating. I said, no, trust me. This is going to be big. Now it's 91% of your organization. Yeah, that's something. At any rate, we have that in there. I continued working on the legislation at the same time. And so in a sense, what became Jim and I, after that meeting in Thanksgiving, we had several people from the industry, what became the core of the industry, working with us. Okay. And then around 1973, at the end of 1973, I sold my interest to Jim on the newsletters, but agreed to spend 1 day a week writing articles for him. Okay. And so I got an appointment to the White House on April the 15th, 1974. And it became quite apparent that, it might be a conflict of interest, writing articles for an industry newsletter.
Sure.
And so I told him I had to drop this, and And that became eventually the energy office at the White House became the FEA, and the FEA became DOE. Mm-hmm. And so that was April the 15th was my beginning of a 38-year career with the federal government.
Mm-hmm. So you came to the federal government sort of through this beginnings of SEIA and through the solar industry,
right? Because the Nixon White House saw SEIA as, well, you must have an industry perspective and not one of these wild perspectives.
Yeah,
and so that was an interesting experience.
So at what point in that 38-year career with the government did you sort of look back and realize how much had changed with regards to solar? And, we're sitting here now 50 years later with, hundreds of gigawatts installed and millions of installations across the country. And when you sort of helped found this organization in 1974, it was a very different landscape. Obviously, you had to sort of convince some skeptics. Well, at what point, how did you see it grow in the decades that followed, and at what point did you sort of look back and realize that what you had created had really taken off?
Well, let's talk about what you are today is basically PV, okay, and storage.
Mm-hmm.
And my first contract out of the White House was to Spectralab and to Bill Yerkes, who later I assumed his history, where he actually created Arco Solar and also was the first to put out a central power plant,
mm-hmm.
as well as he was involved also in residential. Okay. Now, we wanted to do an assessment of what's the potential on photovoltaics. And we looked at the Boston Consulting Group and their methodology. We also did an engineering analysis of this. And this study I did with him was later regurgitated with NASA and IRTA and, later versions. That's how contractors seem to do things. And, but it showed the necessity to find those early markets for photovoltaics that were cost effective.
Mm-hmm.
We were in the FEA side, we were promoting tech transfer, accelerated commercialization, incentives, those things to help the industry build itself, and have the resources for their own research, as well as us having the government have an appropriate program, okay? And one of the early studies that I started was on was a contract with BDM Corporation, which assessed the market, particularly in the federal government and the Department of Defense, for early photovoltaic applications. And that was it became the Federal Photovoltaic Utilization Program. Actually, in my briefcase, I can show you the cover, what we call the silver bullet. The research was started in 1975, but it was an executive summary and storyboard format.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was in my prior life, when I was working on military and space engineering programs, we would have to, in our proposals, put an executive summary and storyboard format so that the generals didn't have too much to read.
Yeah.
And so this is what I did, because nobody was going to read a thick report that was so many inches and heavy to carry.
Mm-hmm.
And so we did many copies. And that happened for some reason to go out to every key congressman and senator.
Mm.
And so that when that bill was passed, we got, I think it was about $100 million for the first year, which was real money in those days. And so that jump started, and that eventually led to over 3,000 applications in the Department of Defense. Can you imagine the cost of taking fuel by helicopter to an island or a remote station,
right,
versus having something run on its own?
Right.
Yeah.
So it was very, very cost effective.
As you're thinking about the history and the work that you did to make this industry what it is today, what do you think are the key moments? What do you think are the drivers that led, in addition to examples like this, that made solar energy be a realistic option in the energy system?
Okay, let's just take a look at around. I moved from after I was in the solar policy and planning in the assistant secretaries. I came down and I started working with Fred Morse on policy and planning under a guy named Walt Priestner. Okay, and I got to a point where I got tired of paper.
I hear that.
Paper.
Same.
Paper and more paper. And so I wanted to get my hands dirty. So I negotiated a transfer to the photovoltaic division, which took place in April of 1980. And they broke off from the systems engineering program, a separate program on residential photovoltaics. So I started that program. And that year I had to come up with the implementation plan, what we would be doing, what the approach was, and what have you. I also had 2 residential experiment stations, one at MIT and one at Las Cruces, New Mexico.
Interesting.
The University of New Mexico. And then we had Lawrence Livermore, and then we had Lawrence Berkeley, and so forth. And but the primary for research during the first decade or so, the key national lab was Jet Propulsion Lab under NASA.
Sure.
And so in the first on page 1 of my report, which was published on January 1981, I introduced a new term, net zero energy. It's become.
So that was you.
Yeah, it became.
I've been using that ever since.
Yes, it became popular, and so we went ahead and had a competition for the Southeast Residential Experiment Station, and and FSEC won that, the Florida Solar Energy Center, and Jerry Ventry would head that up. Now, Jerry Ventry also headed the conservation or energy efficiency program in buildings. So those were the 2 ingredients that were necessary to go to net zero. And in 1982, we adopted that as the program goal for the residential PV program, net zero energy. That's sort of when net zero energy sort of went by the wayside for a while until President Bosh number 2 came along, and the Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, Garman, who came over from the Senate side, said, we're going to go for moonshots. And the moonshot for the buildings program was net zero energy. And we scratched our heads and said, well, how are we going to do that, cost effectively? And sure enough, we did. It became a reality, and that was my thrust one of my primary thrusts, for the rest of my career, and even afterwards.
That's amazing.
Using PV as a key component, or
no, the whole thing.
Yeah.
The evolution of net zero energy was that we would reduce the energy load within the buildings by over 50% or even more, and then the amount of PV necessary to go to net zero would be smaller. The other revolution that occurred, of course, was storage, and in the last 10, 15 years, we dropped over 95% in the cost of storage. It was phenomenal. And so the concept of microgrids, whether it be a single residence home or a data center or whatever, that combination, reducing the load and having affordable storage, and as part of the grid modernization program within the department and the various agencies to enable the appropriate integration of distributed energy resources into the grid system. This is what's going on now, and it started in the I was going to conferences on that in the end of the end of the Bush administration and beginning of the Obama administration. Okay, so that's where we're at today, and both in distributed energy and as well as your central supplies. Okay, and as a favor to France, I've helped them, put together their little systems. One was a 2.5 megawatt system that was done in 2014, and then right now I was helping a friend putting up a 25 megawatt system.
Great,
but again, as a favor.
So do you find yourself surprised at how fast this industry has grown, or how much solar there is, or does it just sort of feel like it was meant to be?
It was meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was wondering about your vision, right? 50 years ago, you're sitting around that table and you're conceptualizing what this could become. Yeah. And obviously so much of what you've already talked about it's become a reality. Was that your vision? Are you surprised?
I was talking to Norm Lukatheder this week. Okay, yesterday I was over his house, and he lives in Annapolis also. And at the same time he was doing the work on the federal photovoltaic utilization program, he was also looking at the early distributed applications. And he worked under Fred Morse on international. And Fred, I think at that time, at the 80, 81, 82, around that time, Fred had responsibility for international within the Office of, what is today Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. Okay. And so Norm spent a lot of time in Africa working on solar applications in different countries there. And so, and in fact, since I retired from the federal government in 2012, I consulted back to DOE later and to the universities, as well as working with Norm on proposals for distributed applications in Africa. Okay. So there's no other choice, I mean, yes, they have potential for large central power stations, but that's been a dream between the nuclear, they're putting up coal plants in pristine Kenya, which is a shame. But they also have the potential of large hydro, which is renewable in Kinshasa and other areas. So there's a tremendous potential there, and it's changing the whole way of living for the average person in Africa. And recently we've been helping with distant education in Africa, which needs energy, and that's had a lot of success. They're very entrepreneurial in Africa. They're very, very eager to start businesses.
Mm-hmm. As they should be.
Yes, they're very capitalistic. And so what else do they have? They have photovoltaics, they have storage, and they have a lot of energy.
Were you looking outside the U.S. in the early days of this, when you were thinking about innovation and being inspired by what other governments might have been trying to get ahead of us to get accomplished in this renewable space?
I remember when I was in the White House, I got a call. I was sitting at the desk, and they said, the senator is going on. He's going to be on the floor this afternoon. We'd like to put in a little amendment or so. Could you help? So on the back of the envelope, I wrote out an amendment in terms of the role of solar in international. And so I got a call back. It passed.
That's all it takes.
That was kind of funny.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that in 2023, we just reported in our last Solar Market Insight report that solar was accounted for 50% of electricity generating capacity on the grid for the first time. Over 50% in over 50 years, since hydro was the renewable source that was driving that sort of capacity. It's just been amazing to see how quickly it's grown, especially over the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, take a look at what Senator Manchin did. He was the head of the Energy Committee in the Senate, and he's been pushing for an all of the above solution, because that's the only way we're going to get there, and it's the only way we're going to have economic security and national security. And without the economic security, you're not going to have the resources for a transition to zero carbon.
Right.
You're going to get in a really difficult economic situation, as we are now with our deficit spending and what have you. So we need to have an all of the above approach to give us the resources that we need to make this transition.
Yeah, and it's clear that if you take that approach, lowest cost wins, and solar is lowest cost in a lot of places in this country. So
yes, that works out. But again, it's all the above.
I have a question about this sort of battleground. So you've been in this industry for a long time. There have been pivotal moments of policy change and growth. 2005, 2008, 2016, 2022 with the passage of the IRA. When you look back on your career, since we're capturing this for the record, are there any battles that you lost that stick out in your mind to promote this space?
Well, when I drafted the projections for residential PV, and again, this was all not just me. This was NASA, and this was all the PV technologies. We're looking at a projection for 50 cents a peak watt by 1988, which is a little bit ambitious. But along comes a change in the administration. And that our budgets were cut. We had massive layoffs in the even in photovoltaics. one friend of mine, there were some tragedies, deaths, from either the stress or other things.
Mm-hmm.
And even one of the top people over at JPL died. Our systems engineering person died, and it was a lot of reshuffling and other issues. And my program continued to get supported, and they realized that as long as I was there, somehow my program would be funded. It's like they thought that I had connections on the Hill. But that was a major drop in the whole program, where our whole program crashed. I could tell you maybe offline what really happened.
Well, yeah, we'll save that for...
Got it. We'll edit that out.
Yeah.
Edit it out. But somehow a group of people gathered at that time at the Senate office building, including the Window Association, the SEIA, others, and somehow we got with the help of was Hollingsworth or so from South Carolina. Okay, we got a stop in the decline of the solar budget. It was just going down and down. They got it. And I may have helped organize that.
That's great.
And so, but that was unofficial.
Yeah.
1985, I was in the credit union, and the deputy assistant or assistant secretary for solar was in front of me, and I was complaining about those folks over in energy efficiency are wasting all my good electricity. Next thing I know is I get a note, go fix it.
Yeah.
So I spent the next year's research, and bringing down the cost of substantially of the key technologies, and then eventually moving over to the buildings, the Building America program, and working towards net zero energy in a big way, holistically way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then I continued that after I left.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So, at any rate, we have a lot of heroes that made this all possible. You have to go back to because all the budget pressures that were on NASA during the 60s. Trying to go to the moon, we were spending an awful lot of money.
Mm-hmm.
Certain senators like McGovern and all said, "Let's shut this down." Sure. and put research on national needs or human needs.
Mm-hmm.
We called him a neo-Luddite. and so, yes, I worked very hard with Senator Jackson's office and others, to try and counter this. And but getting back to the in around 1968, we had Peter Glaser publish his paper on using space-generated PV beamed down to Earth for power. And then you had Kraft-Derricky with his concept. In 71, 72, you started having hearings in NASA, on such energy applications and national needs. In 1968, President Johnson signed into legislation a bill that would increase the research activities at the National Science Foundation for research that would be applied to societal needs. 1971, beginning, President Nixon established the Research Applied to National Needs. And early on, that it probably was preceded in the earlier organization, there was a lot of enthusiasm for solar.
Mm-hmm.
And so the core of the National Solar Energy Program was created at the National Science Foundation.
Mm.
For example, Lloyd Herwig ran the Advanced Solar Technologies Program, and he had a branch under him under Dick Blyden on photovoltaics.
Hmm.
And so there was a publication that was came out of a conference in 1998 and was published in the American Physics Institute. And that paper was Cherry Hill Revisited, two parts. The first part by Lloyd Herwig and the other part by Dick Blyden. And that sort of described a lot of the history, okay. There are other references, such as, testimonies by Sheldon Budd and others in terms of the impact of the climate control study that was done in March of in 74, which give you a real sense of the environment for solar at the time. But so they got together and they started forming the first 5-year plan for solar energy. And that was done in the summer of 72 and was published around October and submitted to OMB, okay, for a comprehensive program, which included PV, okay. Around the same time, we had the NSF NASA Solar Energy Panel. That included Lloyd Herwig, Fred Morse, Bill Cherry, and many others, okay, in that organization. It included 7 workshops, technical workshops for the different technologies, and 2 program reviews. It resulted in a white paper or a publication, and I have a copy of that if you like, published December of 72. There were earlier reports on solar heating, because that was one of the earlier ones. That all led, the earlier 5-year plan, the earlier reports on solar heating probably led to Mike McCormick introducing the Solar Heating and Cooling Demonstration Act, or Research and Demonstration Act, or whatever I don't remember the title. I have a copy of it in around October or so, and eventually that there were hearings in March of 74 on that, which Sheldon Budd participated in. Okay, he also referenced all the work on the Solar RD&D Act by Senator Humphrey. Okay, and I'll give you a copy of that if you like. So that created the core of the program. Okay, then along comes President Nixon and the oil embargo.
Mm-hmm.
And so he created the Energy Policy Office in the White House and the Project Independence blueprint. That's what I was hired to do. I was hired to do the solar portion as well as tech transfer and what have you. And I worked with people like Don Beatty and others who came over from NASA or at the NSF program on solar. And I worked with all the folks over at the NSF. And I remember being in a meeting with Dick Blyden, and they were laying out a program, and I said, that doesn't sound too aggressive, if we're trying to achieve anything. Could we do something a little bit stronger for PV? I'm not sure if I was in line 100% with O&D. I'm not sure if I should tell you that offline.
We'll save that for later, too, I guess.
Yes. I had called into a meeting at the Office of Management or at the White House in the new executive office building. And they started interrogating me, and they said, who does Humphrey think he is writing this? And I said, well, I think he's a U.S. Senator. Who do you think you are? Just a consultant? And they kept on that because it was under the pretense of going over my tech transfer section within the Project Independence. And I think I must have made going down the elevator with them, I must have made a very bad wisecrack. And the general I was reporting to told me to hide. And he said, hide for about a week or so. So 1 week later, President Nixon took a helicopter ride, and President Ford took over.
Yeah.
Fortunately, he was a friend of Humphrey. And so he knew me, but I didn't know him personally. But the next time I met with the folks, they came up to me and said, President Ford asked us to apologize to you.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
That's all it takes.
That's
Some things stay the same in Washington, I guess.
Yeah, that's an amazing tidbit.
I probably deserved worse treatment.
Well, Sam, you've been so generous with your time. This has been fascinating, just getting to dig into all the history and hear from you about what you experienced and what you've seen over these many decades. So I want to thank, on behalf of everyone here at SEIA, not just for being here, but for creating this organization. We love working here, and we love doing the work that you started, and we're going to keep it going. So.
Well, thank you so much. And again, I'd like to say that the work that you're doing right now is so important, particularly your meeting in last week in Texas on looking at your grid security and what have you. And that's very important. That's in line with the grid modernization efforts. You have to assure that you have the cybersecurity and EMP resistance and what have you on and the microgrids that you're working on are probably going to be the most critical thing you can do worldwide. So, at any rate, anything I can do to help, let me know.
Well, we will, and thanks again. This has been fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.